Few stories have stirred more debate than those of David and Solomon. Were they rulers of a vast, wealthy empire, or were they only remembered that way centuries later? Archaeologists, historians, and believers continue to wrestle with this question, and the answers often depend on how you read both the Bible and the ruins left in the ground. The reigns of King David and King Solomon represent the pinnacle of ancient Israel's history. It was a time of united Israel, a kingdom stretching from the borders of Egypt to the Euphrates, with its capital at Jerusalem overflowing with wealth, wisdom, and grandeur. David's rise from shepherd to king was not just the story of one man gaining power, it was the shaping of a national identity formed out of loose tribal confederation. By uniting the northern and southern tribes, he forged a stable foundation that allowed the kingdom to transition from loose alliances to centralized rule. His military campaigns that he carried out would break the dominance of hostile neighbors. He then went on to secure trade routes and establish Jerusalem as both the political and spiritual heart of the nation. Solomon, who inherited this legacy, presided over an era of unprecedented prosperity. Under his reign, Israel became an influential player in the regional power structure of the ancient Near East. The construction of the temple was an architectural achievement, but it was more than just that. It was more of an embodiment of Israel's covenantal relationship with God in stone and gold. Trade networks stretched to Arabia and beyond, bringing wealth, exotic goods, and international recognition. From the historian's perspective, this united monarchy marked a transition point where Israel moved onto the world stage. From the believer's perspective, it stood as the fulfillment of God's promises. Both views, when taken together, are the reason why David's and Solomon era is still studied, honored, and remembered as a high point in the ancient world's story. This story of David and Solomon is woven into religious tradition, shaping how entire cultures view their past. But history, as it turns out, isn't always as neat as the stories we inherit. At least that's what many historians and scholars would have you believe. When archaeologists sift through the soil of ancient cities, they don't always come to the same conclusion. Some scholars argue that David and Solomon were little more than tribal chieftains, ruling over a modest hill country settlements rather than a sprawling empire. Others insist that the grandeur of their reigns is supported by clear evidence. In the world of biblical scholarship, the existence of David and Solomon is not the raging battlefield at this point. The overwhelming majority of historians and archaeologists agree that these were real figures. The quarrel where it exists is not about whether they lived, but about the scope of their rule. Was their united kingdom a sweeping regional power stretching from the Euphrates to Egypt, or was it a smaller and more modest realm centered in the hill country of Judah? But before we move on towards the evidence of such a kingdom of David and Solomon as described in the Bible, let's first look at the evidence that supports their existence. However, archaeology doesn't always give us quick answers. It speaks slowly through stone and artifacts, and sometimes that testimony comes not from Israel itself, but from its rival. The Tel Dan stele and the Mesa stele are the two ancient monuments that mentions David by name, and thus provide confirmation of his existence from sources outside the biblical texts. The Tel Dan stele is a fragmentary basal inscription carved in Old Aramaic, dating to the 9th century BCE. Today it is on display on Israel Museum in Jerusalem. It was discovered in July 1993 at the site of Tel Dan in northern Israel, near the modern border with Lebanon. The site had been under excavation for decades under the direction of Abraham Byron, one of Israel's most respected archaeologists. That summer, Gila Cook, a member of Byron's team, found a broken basal fragment reused in the wall of a later building, which bore ancient letters. A year later, in 1994, two additional fragments were found, also reused in later construction. When pieced together, they formed part of a once large commemorative stele. The stele had originally stood as a public monument, likely in a place of prominence such as a city gate or a temple courtyard. At some point centuries later, it was smashed and the fragments repurposed as building stones, and ironically, it was thus preserved for us to find it later. The surviving text is in Old Aramaic, and it uses a script style consistent with the late 9th century BCE. On the surface of this stele is a text that we could call it a royal boast, that proclaims the victories of an ancient king over his enemies. On it there is a short phrase, House of David. This is the earliest widely accepted extra-biblical reference to King David, founder of the Judahite monarchy. and it is written not by a Judahite scribe, but by a foreign enemy king. It is generally attributed to King Hazael of Aram Damascus, a formidable regional power during that era. While parts are missing, the reconstructed translation reads approximately, I killed Jehoram, son of Ahab, king of Israel, and I killed Ahaziah, son of Jehoram, king of the house of David. Even with gaps in the text, the meaning is unambiguous. The author claims military victory over two kings, one ruling Israel, the northern kingdom, and one ruling Judah, the southern kingdom. The kingdom of Judah is identified by dynastic title, House of David. The events described aligns closely with the historical backdrop of the 9th century BCE, as recorded in the Hebrew Bible. Around this time, both Jehoram of Israel and Ahaziah of Judah died in political turmoil connected to the rise of Jehu. The biblical text attributes their deaths to internal coups, not to Hazael. But the tale then still presents a rival version, with Hazael himself taking the credit for killing them both. This is typical of royal inscriptions in the ancient Near East, a type of propaganda that was designed to magnify the ruler's achievement and often exaggerate or adapt events to glorify their reign. The crucial point is the title House of David. The phrase is Semitic royal titulature works, much like House of Tudor or House of Habsburg in European history. It denotes a ruling dynasty founded by an ancestor. Here, House of David implies that David was a real figure in the past. He founded a recognized royal line in Judah, and his name carried political weight more than a century after his death. Before 1993, skeptics argued that David might have been a legendary figure invented by later Judahite writers to give their monarchy a heroic origin story. The skepticism was fueled by the absence of archaeological inscriptions naming him. The tale then still changed that. It provided an independent sources that is written by a foreign king and not by Judahite scribe. A clear dynastic reference, House of David, is specific, political, and difficult to explain as myth-making. The stele dates only about 120 to 150 years after David's supposed reign, and well within the period when collective memory of such a king could still be accurate. While it doesn't prove the biblical David's entire story, it however demonstrates that by the late 9th century BCE, Judah's royal house traces itself back to a founder named David, and that foreign states recognized that fact. The vast majority of epigraphers and historians accept the tale then stele as authentic and the House of David reading as correct. A small minority once suggested alternative readings, but these have not gained traction. The next monument to mention David by name is the Mesa stele. The Mesa stele is a large black basalt monument carved in the 9th century BCE by King Mesa of Moab, a kingdom east of the Dead Sea in what is now Jordan. Standing originally over a meter tall, the inscription is written in the Moabite language, which is closely related to ancient Hebrew. The story of the Mesa stele's discovery is almost a near tragedy for archaeology. In 1868, a German missionary named Frederick Augustus Klein learned of a large inscribed stone in the town of Dahiban in modern Jordan. The stone was standing in open view and was revered by local Bedouin, but its significance was not understood by them. News of the find reached Charles Clement Gnu, a French diplomat and amateur archaeologist. He understood its importance and sent Arab agents to make a wet paper impression of the inscription. This angered the local tribes, who feared that the foreigners were trying to steal their treasure. Before the stone could be secured, a conflict broke out among the Bedouin. In an attempt to prevent the stone from being taken, they heated the stone in a fire and poured cold water over it, causing it to shatter into many pieces. Fortunately, Clermont Gnu's paper impression preserved the outline of the text. Over time, archaeologists recovered many of the fragments. These were then sent to Paris. Today, the reconstructed stele stands in the Louvre Museum, pieced together from the surviving fragments and the early paper copy made before its destruction. The text in this stele, which is written from Mesa's own perspective, is a royal victory monument. In broad terms, it says that Moab had been oppressed by Israel under King Omri and his son. It also claims to have rebelled successfully, defeated Israelite forces, and rebuilt Moabite cities. He attributes his success to his god Chemos. He lists various cities taken from Israel and the fortifications and religious structures he built. The fragment in question occurs in line 31 of the inscription. The context is Mesa boasting about taking the city of Horonaim and defeating its defenders. The partially preserved letters appears to read, "And the men of the house of David dwelt in." If this is correct, it would back up the Telden Stiles record of David, showing that different nearby nations, including the Arameans and the Moabites, recognized Judah as the house of David. The Bible in 2 Kings chapter 3 describes a similar episode. Moab was subject to Israel and was paying tribute in lambs and wool. After Ahab's death, Massa rebelled and prompted a joint military campaign by Israel, Judah, and Edom. The biblical account and the Massa Stele tell the story from opposite sides, where each source is claiming success. The mention of the house of David in the Moabite version fits the Judah's involvement in Transjordan at the time. Even if Massa exaggerates or leaves out some defeats, the fact that he names Judah's dynasty shows that David was remembered as a real founder, whose family was politically active in the region. The reading of the house of David is debated. Still, many leading epigraphers and historians consider it plausible, so it has become part of the discussion on David's historicity. Even if this reading is later rejected, the Stele still supports the general history of Israel and Judah in the 9th century BCE, as described in the Bible. So the debate over David's existence has largely been settled by the discoveries at Tel Dan and Dibon, where inscriptions from Israel's Negev testify to the reality of a house of David. When it comes to archaeology, King Solomon is still something of a mystery. To this day, no inscription or monument has ever been found that carries his name directly. Yet despite this, most scholars do not doubt that Solomon actually lived. The reason is simple. We already have solid archaeological evidence for his father, King David. Yet this only takes us part of the way. What still remains under question is the size, strength, and very nature of the kingdom that David and Solomon ruled. Was it truly the united monarchy that the Bible describes, stretching from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south, or was it something smaller and less centralized? A number of scholars, often called biblical minimalists, argue that the Bible exaggerates. They believed that Israel in the 10th century BCE was poorer, loosely organized, and made up of scattered tribes. In their view, David and Solomon were more like small local chieftains than rulers of a great kingdom. But the archaeology tells us a different story. One of the most striking lines of evidence comes from monumental architecture. The massive fortified city gates discovered at Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. These gates date back to the 10th century BCE, the very period traditionally associated with Solomon. And they are almost identical in design and dimensions, which suggests a coordinated building program carried out by a central authority. The discovery and interpretation of these gates owe much to the work of Professor Yigael Yadin. Yadin was a figure of many talents, a military commander during Israel's 1948 War of Independence, later serving as Chief of Staff of the Israel Defense Forces and Deputy Prime Minister. But in addition to his political and military career, Yadin was also one of Israel's most celebrated archaeologists. Between 1957 and 1970, Yadin carried out extensive excavations at Hazor and Megiddo, two of the most prominent cities in ancient Israel. He also studied the remains at Gezer, where others had excavated earlier. What struck Yadin was the remarkable similarity in construction at all three sites, particularly in relation to their city gates and defensive walls. Each site rebuilt the remains of a 6-chambered gatehouse, with 3 chambers on each side, constructed with a casement wall system. Even more striking was the fact that the dimensions of these gates were virtually identical. At Hazor and Megiddo, the measurements matched almost exactly, down to the nearest centimeter, while the gate at Gezer, though slightly adapted to the terrain, still followed the same architectural pattern. These gates were not small structures, they were monumental in scale and design. They indicate a high level of planning, skilled labor, and centralized oversight. The fact that these major cities, located more than 100 kilometers apart and built near identical gates at roughly the same time, strongly suggests a unified building program directed by a powerful ruler. Archaeologists came to call these structures Solomonic gates or 6-chambered gates. Kathleen Stellmeyer, in her research on these gates, summed up Yadin's finding very well. When Yadin was excavating at each site, he noticed that several features seemed to be extremely familiar. The design, dimension, construction, and artistic features remained constant. Looking at each site's specific stratigraphy, it revealed that within a short period of time, these 3 cities grew from being relatively small fortifications into huge fortified cities, all with specific construction patterning to particular wall systems and well-built 6-chambered city gates, all following a similar construction pattern. The gates then are more than just architectural curiosities. They provide hard evidence that the 10th century BC in Israel was a period of major urban development with coordinated construction and centralized government. Then the question that naturally follows is, who was responsible for these gates? Given the time period, the biblical tradition, and the sheer scale of the project, the most plausible candidate is Solomon. These were not the works of a minor chieftain, but of a ruler with substantial power, wealth, and authority. In 1 Kings chapter 9, after the detailed accounts of Solomon's construction of the temple and his palace, the text goes on to describe the wider scope of his building activities. In 1 Kings chapter 9 verse 15 reads, "And this is the account of the forced labor that King Solomon drafted to build the house of the Lord, and his own house, and the Millo, and the wall of Jerusalem, and Hazor, and Megiddo, and Gezer." The evidence doesn't stop there. Among the architectural features were Proto-Aeolic capitals, which are decorative carved stone elements usually linked with the royal and elite buildings. They reflect a strong Phoenician influence. This fits perfectly with the biblical account of Solomon's alliance with Hiram, king of Tyre, who supplied skilled craftsmen, quality timber, and expertise in monumental construction. Archaeology in this case provides a clear echo of the very cooperation described in the Bible. Even more striking is the construction technique. The biblical text emphasizes the use of 3 rows of hewn stone and a row of cedar beams. At Megiddo, archaeologists uncovered horizontal gaps in gate walls that once held wooden beams, the remains of which were still preserved when excavated. Similar methods were observed at Lachish and other sites. Scholars like David Ussiskin and R.S. Lehman have noted how closely this building style mirrors the biblical account, which suggests that the writers of Kings were describing practices they had either witnessed or reliably remembered. Among the remarkable finds from this period is a delicate Phoenician-style gold basket pendant dated to the 10th century BCE. It was uncovered during excavations at Tel Megiddo, one of the key administrative and military centers in the north. The pendant is small in size but finely crafted, its design reflecting the characteristic artistry of Phoenician goldsmiths, who were renowned across the eastern Mediterranean for their skill. This is significant because the biblical account of Solomon repeatedly emphasizes his alliance with Hiram, king of Tyre, and the importation of Phoenician craftsmen and luxury goods. The pendant therefore serves as a tangible example of that cultural exchange. Its presence at a major Israelite site in the 10th century indicates not only contact with Phoenician artisanship, but also the existence of an elite class wealthy enough to acquire and value such objects. And yet the picture of Solomon's time does not stop with monumental gates or Phoenician-style capitals. In 2012, Dr. Eilat Mazar uncovered another fascinating piece of evidence from the offal, just south of the Temple Mount. Among the remains of large storage jars, one stood out. It carried an inscription dating to the 10th century BCE, making it the earliest alphabetical writing ever discovered in Jerusalem. At first, the fragmentary letters puzzled scholars, but epigrapher Dr. Daniel Van Stub advanced a groundbreaking interpretation. The text is not early Hebrew or Canaanite, but ancient South Arabian, the script of the biblical Seba. According to Van Stub, the words read Selden 5, meaning 5 measures of ladanum. Ladanum is a fragrant resin widely used in the ancient world for incense. Biblical texts identify it with seholet. This was one of the sacred ingredients of the incense offered in the first and second temples. This detail transforms the find into more than just a scribble on a jar. If Van Stub is true, then as early as the 10th century, Sabian merchants or functionaries from South Arabia were active in Jerusalem, involved in trade of luxury and cultic goods. Van Stub himself noted that this was the first ancient South Arabian inscription ever discovered this far north. And a crucial point to be noted here is that it was locally engraved. In other words, it is direct evidence that a Sabian agent was operating inside Jerusalem itself during Solomon's reign. The Bible recounts that the Queen of Sheba visited Solomon in Jerusalem, bringing with her an abundance of wealth and spices. 1 Kings chapter 10 verse 10 says, "Then she gave the king 120 talents of gold and a very great quantity of spices and precious stones. Never again came such an abundance of spices as these that the Queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon." The Ophel Pythos inscription does not simply echo this story, it provides archaeological context, showing that the trade in Sabian incense was active in Jerusalem precisely during the era the Bible narrative describes. So what does this all mean? First, the 6 chambered gates at 3 locations are almost identical. Then the presence of Phoenician influence in the 10th century BC. Then again the evidence of Sabian merchant active in Jerusalem during the 10th century BC. Taken together, all this evidence, the archaeological record and the biblical text, present a coherent picture of powerful centralized authority in the 10th century BC. The most straightforward explanation is that Solomon's kingdom, as described in the Bible, truly had the resource and ambition to leave a lasting mark on the land. By the mid-1980s, a new and controversial way of looking at the history of ancient Israel began to take root among archaeologists and historians. This movement became known as biblical minimalism. Its advocates argued that the Hebrew Bible is not a reliable historical source, but rather a work of literature written centuries after the events it describes. According to this school of thought, the Bible contains only faint echoes of history, wrapped in layers of myth, exaggeration, and political propaganda. One of the most influential voices of this movement is Professor Israel Finkelstein, a leading archaeologist and one of the principal excavators at Megiddo. Finkelstein became the central figure in what is often called the low chronology debate. His aim was to change the dating of the great buildings usually connected with Solomon's reign. These include the 6 chambered gates and other large constructions at Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. Instead of placing them in the 10th century BCE, he argued that they belonged to the 9th century BCE, during the rule of the Omrid dynasty in the northern kingdom of Israel. This reinterpretation was groundbreaking. For years, scholars had believed that the great fortifications and palaces at these sites came from Solomon's building projects described in the 1 Kings chapter 9 verse 15 to 19. But if Finkelstein was right, the idea of Solomon ruling a rich and powerful kingdom falls apart. Instead, David and Solomon would belong to a poorer and divided time called the Iron Age I. The so-called united monarchy in the Bible would be more of a later invention than a historical reality. Finkelstein built his cases on two main archaeological observations. Finkelstein noted that pottery found at Megiddo's 6 chambered gate looked more like pottery from Jezreel, which he dates to the 9th century BCE. He argued that the gate should be dated to the same period because the ceramic styles matches better with the 9th century than the 10th. Next, he observed that the early layers at Megiddo did not contain the typical 11th century Philistine bichrome pottery. Since this pottery is usually expected from that period, its absence made Finkelstein conclude that the gate was likely built later, during the 9th century under the Omrid kings, rather than in the time of Solomon. By compressing the timeline in this way, Finkelstein concluded that there was no firm archaeological basis for identifying a grand 10th century Solomonic kingdom. Instead, he suggested that what archaeologists had long attributed to Solomon was in fact works of later kings like Omri and Ahab in the north. However, Finkelstein's theory required dismissing one major piece of evidence, a fragment of victory stele from Pharaoh Shoshank I, discovered at Megiddo. Shoshank invaded Israel in the late 10th century BCE, shortly after Solomon's reign. This event is described both in the Bible and in the Egyptian records carved in the temple wall at Karnak. Importantly, the Karnak relief mentions Megiddo by name. Finkelstein countered by pointing out that the stele fragment was found in secondary use, not in its original context, and therefore in his view could not serve as a solid evidence for dating the monumental remains. Nevertheless, many scholars argue that dismissing the Shoshank evidence is difficult since the Egyptian campaign lists are clear and the biblical and Egyptian accounts align in remarkable ways. But not all archaeologists agreed with this downgrading of Jerusalem. Around the same time, another dig told a very different story. Mazar was one of Jerusalem's most experienced archaeologists, and in 1986 she began excavations on the Ophel, the area between the city of David and the Temple Mount. Working with her grandfather, Professor Benjamin Mazar, she uncovered a peculiar structure inside a massive tower on the eastern side of the Ophel. When surveyor Lynn Rittmeyer drew the plan and compared it with known examples from other sites, the resemblance was unmistakable. It looked just like a First Temple period city gatehouse. Gatehouses of this kind with 4 chambers and a large approach tower were already known from Hazor and Megiddo. Mazar later recalled that this was a light bulb moment. Everything fit together. The chambers connected directly to the large tower, forming a classic gate complex. Careful measurements confirmed the parallels. The Jerusalem gatehouse was almost identical in size to the one at Megiddo, 10.4 by 14.8 meters compared to 10.2 by 14.6 meters. Even the inner chambers and wall thickness matched. To Mazar, such close similarities could not be a coincidence. They looked like parts of the same architectural plan, directed by a single central authority. Fast forward to the dig in 2009 to 2010, and Eilat Mazar announced that she had gathered enough evidence to date this entire gate complex to the 10th century BCE, the time of Solomon. After the rise of biblical minimalism, many had argued that Jerusalem in the 10th century was too small to produce such works, suggesting that state-level building only emerged later under kings like Hezekiah. Mazar's discovery changed that picture. A monumental 10th century gatehouse in Jerusalem itself suggested that the city was indeed the powerful capital the Bible describes. Another important site brings us to a place called Kirvet Qeiyafa. It is located in the Shephelah, the borderland between Judah and Philistia. Excavations began in 2007 under Professor Yosef Garfinkel. Since then, the site has become one of the strongest pieces of evidence in the debate over the United Monarchy. At first glance, Kirvet Qeiyafa appeared to be little more than a small ruin, but excavations soon uncovered something remarkable. Beneath the surface was a fully planned fortified city. It was enclosed by a massive casement wall and protected by two monumental gates. That is unusual, since most cities in the region had only one gate. Some scholars even connect this with the biblical reference to Saraim, the place of two gates, mentioned in 1 Samuel chapter 17 verse 52. Radiocarbon samples from the site date its occupation to the late 11th and early 10th centuries BCE, exactly the time of David's rise and reign. What the city represents is state-level planning. The fortifications, the gates, the street layouts, and the large administrative building at the center of the site. This is not the work of scattered village tribes, but of a centralized polity. Of course, not everyone accepted this conclusion. Finkelstein himself acknowledged the site's importance and its dating to the 10th century BCE, but resisted the claim that it was Judahite. Instead, he argued that the short-lived settlement may have been a Canaanite or Philistine outpost, rather than the evidence of David's kingdom. For many scholars, the simplest explanation is that this city reflects the beginning of state formation in Judah. This is the same process described in the Bible during the reign of David. I hope you have enjoyed the video. If you did so, then please like this video and subscribe to this channel, and thanks for watching.